I'm Shruta from FIGHT, and I'm presenting my PhD paper titled as Effect of Violent Conflict on Female Decision-Making Power within the Household. The empowerment of women is considered as a crucial driver for sustainable development, which contributes to individual as well as household level well-being. This perspective is also aligned with the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, where Goal 5 also underscores the global commitment to achieve gender equality and empowering the women. Women empowerment also contributes many areas such as child health, education, gender equality, and employment. But unfortunately, Pakistan ranked 161 out of 191 countries on gender inequality index. In Pakistan, only 20% of gender equality persists according to the Gender Equality in Employment and Economic Benefits for 2020. As we know that female decision-making power or women empowerment, decision-making power is basically the main component of the women empowerment. So when we study the economics, we also emphasize that the allocation of scarce resources is the fundamental focus in economic studies, and this allocation is basically based on decision making. But most of the times it is overlooked. We overlook the gender roles and the decision making gender roles in the decision making process. So the analysis of household decision making process and distribution of power within the household has only recently gained empirical traction, and we also note that the decision making within the household based on the preferences, and the preferences can be altered through the exposure to the negative exogenous shocks such as terrorist attacks. We also know that Pakistan, the global recent report of Global Terrorism Index report 2019, Pakistan is ranked on number 5th out of 163 countries with a score of 7.9 out of 10, which is very quite high. And terrorist attack is more than just physical attack. It has long-term effects on psychological. It influences psychological impacts on society. We know violent conflict have adverse effects on all over the society, but it has particularly on women's lives. So, how conflict can impact women decision making? There are many channels, both positive and negative. So I will discuss the negative channel firstly. The first one is the psychological distress and fear induced by such events leads to the sense of powerlessness and reduced agency among the women. And second is the distribution of the disruption of social networks and support systems can isolate women and limiting their access to the resources and information, which is crucial for effective decision making. And thirdly, the economic hardship and resource scarcity resulting from conflict can diminish the women's bargaining power, and additionally, breakdown of social order during the conflict worsens the gender-based violence and the control dynamics. And the lastly, conflict-induced displacement and disruption in the livelihoods also in the livelihood can force women into risky situations where they have limited control over their circumstances. Now, I will discuss the positive channels. I will discuss the channels which have positive impact on women decision taking part in conflict setting. Women often develop resilience and adaptive coping strategies during the conflict and become more assertive and proactive. And the second is active participation in community mobilization and peace building efforts. factors may lead to the recognition, influence, and the leadership. And third is the disruption of traditional gender roles leads to women to assume new responsibilities and roles within their society. And additionally, these conflict also prompt increased investment in women's education and employment opportunities, which ultimately leads to skills and economic independence. And the humanitarian and development program especially focused on women, also increases the women access to resources, training, and support and welfare, which positively contribute their decision-making power. So the research question is to investigate the impact of terrorism on intra-household decision-making with a specific emphasis on female decision-making by Pakistan. We use the data from Household Integrated Economic Survey. We used 3 rounds of highs, 2005-06, then 13-14, and then 18-19. We used 2005-06 as a pre-treatment period because the surge in terrorism attacks was observed in Pakistan after 2005 and 6. And we use the 13-14 round as the treatment period because between 2006 and 14-15 Pakistan experienced a very high incidence of terrorist attacks. And then we used 18-19 to see the impact was persistent in the long term or not. And for the terrorist attacks, we use the data from Global Terrorism Database, which records each and every terrorist attack all over the world. And to measure the exposure to conflict, we take the number of terror attacks during the period of 2006 and 14. We are using the data from the 4 provinces, and we are taking the KT and Balochistan as the treated provinces because there was intensity of terror attacks was very high. Balochistan observed 1,288 attacks during this period. KT observed 1,720 attacks during this period, and Punjab observed 198 and Sindh 736. So we take the Punjab and Sindh as the control group. Mostly terrorist attacks in Sindh was concentrated in the Karachi, so that's why we taking the Sindh as a control. This is a graph which is showing the annual terrorist attacks from 2001 to 2020 in Pakistan. We can see that till 2005 the intensity was low, and after 2005 the terrorist attacks, annual attacks were going up, and till 14, 15 it was on rising trend, and then there is a fall in attacks. So we, to quantify the causal effect of terrorist attacks on women decision making, we use a different methodology. GM is the outcome of interest which measures the women decision making power in province P in period T, and T is the variable for the treatment, and T is the variable for time period, and T is the interaction term which captures the average treatment effect on the treatment. These are the mean differences for the all the 3 rounds, where 2005-06 is the base year, and 13, 14, and 18, 19 are the treated. All the different mean differences are mostly variables are significant and positive. And you can see that the 3.73 is the mean value for the total number of decisions a woman makes in the base year 2005 and 6. These are the other variables with the mean differences. So, the impact of terrorism on women decision making part during the conflict. This model was done for the year 2013-14, and we can see that in all the 3 models, the impact is positive and significant. In the first model, we neither used individual effects nor household effects, and not the province effects also. And then in the model 2, we used only the control for the individual and household level. And in the model 3, we use the both control for both the individual household level characteristics and also for the province. So in model 3, which is our preferred model, there is 0.963 percentage exposure to women. Generally increase the 0.963 percentage points in the probability of making more decisions. And if we compare it to the base value 3.73, it's a 25% increase. In the second model, we use the dichotomous variable to measure the movement decision making part where if movement participates in at least 5 decisions out of 8 decisions, then we consider her as she has a decision making part. So in this, there is also a positive and significant impact on decision making. It's about 12 percentage points increase in probability of women decision making. These are the individual. We also check the impact on the individual decisions. So for all the 8 decisions, there is a positive impact. For education, it's 0.7. For employment, it's 0.6. Birth control, 19.8. Number of children, for 5.9. And food expenditure, it's 60.8. For clothes and footwear, it's 70.7. For medical expenditures, 13.2. And travel and recreational expenditure, which is 8.8. So on all the individual decisions, it has a positive impact. Now, the impact of tariff on women decision making after the government, we are taking the period 18-19 to check the impact. In the long term, the impact is also positive and significant, but the magnitude is lower than the short run, which was 13-14. This is the result for the dichotomous variable which we used in our results. This is also positive. For model 1, it is 9.9 percentage points, and for model 2, 10.7, and model 3, 10.5 percentage points. There is a probability of 10.5 to a woman if she is exposed to a conflict. It makes 10.5% more decisions in a household. These are results for the individual decisions for 2018-19 data. These are also positive and significant, but 2 are reversed. One is for the education decision and number of children, which was positive in the 13-14. So the results indicate that an average increase of approximately 25% in women's participation in decision making, and this underscores the unique and potent effect of high intensity violence. Previously, it was found positive impact, but the magnitude was very low in case of like Mexico. Further, using a stricter way of empowerment, the dichotomous variable of decision making show a 12% increase the probability of women participation, which is slightly lower than during the conflict period. So here are some recommendations. Policymakers should prioritize the implementation of targeted empowerment programs for women during the periods of conflict, particularly individuals affected by high intensity violence. And secondly, they must continue supporting empowerment initiatives even after the conflict to ensure the sustainability of positive changes. And the variation in the nature and intensity of violence across different contexts, the intervention should be tailored to address the specific needs and challenges. And continuous data collection and monitoring efforts are essential to track the changes in women decision making over time. Thank you.
One thing is for sure, I'm doing two difficult things right now. One is that I'm being a chair and then a discussant. And then also, I've been exposed to a paper that is pretty much showing us a very nice picture of a conflict in a manner that at least it is working for the women to gain some empowerment. So whenever you get such results, it becomes a little tricky and it becomes very difficult to sell those results. And hence, I will try my level best to at least come up with certain comments or critique that I believe needs to be taken into account. Because as someone who started off from microeconometric analysis myself in my MPhil and then in my PhD as well, I know one thing for sure, that whenever you get a result, there is a lot more behind the picture that you need to dig into, right? So I try my level best to, in some manner, put some sense into the results and propose a few things. So first thing first, this is a very interesting paper. Obviously, a lot of people talk about conflict, they want to know what is happening in these areas, but data and other issues that are at hand restrict us from doing such analysis, and therefore we don't find much of empirical work or evidence on such topics. So the author in some manner has proposed or has worked on a very important issue, but which is counterintuitively explaining to us that conflict somewhere is empowering women, and she tries her level best to explain that can happen anyways. So she utilizes two important data sources, one from HIES, that's a household survey to bring variation at the household level, and then she's trying to gauge to the terrorism attacks based coming from the GTD database, right? And they're trying to use definitive. So for definitive, everyone knows that we need to have a treatment, we need to have a control, we need to have a pre-treatment observations, post-treatment observations. So somewhere she has done her level best to come up with those variations in the data. The control group, I believe, what I have understood from her analysis is Punjab, Sindh and ICT, where she believes that terrorism attacks are low or minimum or none at all, whatever her assumption is. I would like her to comment over that too. But Balochistan and KP, on the other hand, according to her analysis, is supposed to be the treated group, right? And then there is a time period mentioned by her that there is a terrorist attack somewhere in I believe 2000 and 2014. Though she does not discuss the actual reason behind that terrorist attack, because according to what I have known is that usually terrorists have some specific agenda behind those attacks. Sometimes it is because they want to ruin the schools, sometimes they want to scare the people, sometimes it's political. So I fail to understand that maybe that's missing in the context, like what type of terrorist attack was has taken place in that time period. But anyways, there is a pre-treatment and a post-treatment, and then for a post time period data, she has utilized two time periods. One is for 2013-14, that is going to give you the short-term effect of the conflict, and then there is 2018-19, which according to her is supposed to be the data that is going to give you a longer-term effect of that conflict, right? The dependent variable is nicely built. It basically is comprising on a broad range of binary indicators for whether the women participated in decisions like education, employment, birth control, fertility, purchases, healthcare, mobility, you name it, and it's there. So the key variable of interest as the dependent variable will be interaction between the conflict dummy times the post, which is going to capture the average treatment effect of the conflict, right? Main findings: exposure to violent conflict in the short term based on HIES 2013-14 data increased women's participation in household decisions by 21.8% compared to the baseline. It's a huge number. Again, compared to the literature, it turns out to be a big number. The most significant positive effects were specifically for financial decisions like food, clothing, medical expenses. Well, we can see and increased by 16.8 percentage points for food, 17.7 percentage points for clothing, and then for expenses in medical, it's increasing by 13.2%. The author also examined the long-term effects, and what she found was that for some reason education and employment as well as fertility is affected now negatively, and it's becoming even insignificant in some cases, but for expenses on food, clothing and medical decisions remains significant and quite high in that way. The placebo tests were done to a certain extent to be sure that the identification strategy is intact. So the strength lies in the very fact that the research question itself is different. It has been it has not been explored before, so hence she's giving it a try. It's a quasi-natural experiment design trying to cater to the problem of heterogeneity. It's a strong design. It includes a broad set of indicators measuring empowerment. Strong and positive coefficients are there, differential impacts of violence in the short term, long term, specific domains of empowerment, further highlight the dynamic and evolving nature of gender roles in that context. So now comes my concerns. The way the index for the empowerment has been built, it is not backed up by literature. You are just aggregating it, right? Without consciously explaining why do you believe all of these decisions should be equally weighed. And if you don't have any reason to equally weigh them, then you should be using either principal component analysis or NCA for that matter, because this is how literature builds such a discipline. The second is that the control group, Punjab and Sindh, may not be entirely free from the exposure to the violence. I mean, especially the case for Karachi and Sindh, and in that case, Karachi would be an outlier, and you could either consider excluding Karachi, right, or you can incorporate district level violence intensity to gauge to the fact that you would really want to understand that how immune the people in different districts are to the different levels of intensity of violence. So if you are talking about one exogenous terrorist attack, you still want to understand that in different districts, people have different immunity levels, right, to the violence. So you want to control that. The classification of provinces as treated or control is based on a very strong assumption of uniform exposure within a treated province. A province in itself is a big area. So in that way, introduce a district level violence intensity index to allow for more variation and reduce aggregation bias, right? The third would be definitive relies on the assumption that there are no time-varying unobserved shocks that differentially impact treatment and control groups. So why are we assuming that? Don't we know that NGOs work differently in Karachi and for other matter KVT and Balochistan do not have them? Do we not know that female literacy is very different amongst these provinces and it is changing over time? And similarly, aid flows. So you need to control for either you control for them or you need to do some placebo tests to identify that these are not changing anyways and hence they should not be having any effect on your parallel effects. So the next thing which again is this sort of problematic for me is that the picture is too good to understand that women have become more empowered. Do you really want to use this word empowerment because it is a very positive word? According to my belief, or what I can understand from my readings and theories that I follow, that it was, or perhaps it is a redundant way of explaining empowerment only through the bargaining powers. Now people have evolved and they understand that empowerment is more than making certain decisions about chores. It is about your freedom. It is about what you're doing, your livelihood, right? So, sense capability approach, I don't know whether you have data on that or not, but you can at least put a limitation that this is just bargaining power and not empowerment itself. Because empowerment is way more than bargaining itself, right? So you might want to put that. The word empowerment itself is sort of a little trouble maybe for me. Then empowerment in a highly sensitive setting, like when you are exposed to a terrorist attack. Now you are saying that this individual, this female has been affected. But then why are you ignoring the fact that the entire household is affected? So you cannot just isolate this female from the rest of the household dynamics. And therefore, without having the male side of the equation, the paper risks interpreting an increase in relative empowerment as an absolute gain, which compromise the overall effect on the household welfare. So I believe this is very important, and I think you need to put some focus on what has happened to the males in the house, why have they changed their decisions towards women who are now going and doing certain chores like earlier those males were doing. So I will give you some examples. Maybe the male himself has left. Migration itself is a very important issue. You can talk about unemployment. The jobs are destroyed. The type of jobs that the males were doing now no longer exist after the terrorist attack, and therefore the women have been compelled to go out and earn something for them. So while empowerment appears to increase, it is unclear whether this translates into a real economy or a burden effect. So you need to sort of disaggregate that too, or at least talk about it. Remedy include the discussion of whether increased decision making is a sign of agency or necessity. It's not changing. Huh? Okay, there. Sorry. So these are a few suggestions. You can just have a look at them. I will just move on to the next important comment that I have: the heterogeneity analysis. I hardly believe that any paper nowadays can be written without incorporating the fact that there are very pre-existing household structures and vulnerabilities that dictate your decisions. So you need to account for them. And for that, I have outlined certain variations that you can incorporate in your analysis. For like, for instance, the gender of the household head, the wealth, asset ownership. I discussed the mechanisms in detail, but I don't have time to go over them. Household structure, nuclear versus extended, number of children, education attainment of women, all of them will be affected differently, and believe me, they mask the actual effects. The women who will be affected negatively will be pretty much masked by the positive effects, and you cannot literally ignore it. If you want to make some target policies, you need to know what is happening to these women in these areas. So this is how you are to include it. The long-term reversal in education fertility, you've shown the result, but you haven't really talked about the mechanisms and why has that been happening. I believe one of the reasons would be the reason why a terrorist attack in itself happened. So it was aimed at destroying the education of that area. I don't know, you need to brief us out on that. So the focus is entirely on married women. You need to talk about the people who have lost lives. The dynamics of the entire region has changed. The people have different traumas now they're struggling with. You cannot ignore that entire framework while talking about conflict-inflicted areas. Last, and which is very important, is that this treatment that you're talking about is not discrete. If you're saying that it is going from 2007 to 2014, it is not a one-time period shock. So which means that somewhere the intensity is changing, somewhere the duration is changing. You cannot ignore that. If you ignore it, a simple definitive is not going to give you an unbiased estimate. Obviously, you need to have some interactions with the intensity squared, some durations and all, and only that is going to give you a good result. Right? I think I would really want to suggest do a bandwidth analysis by looking at the epicenter of the place, where I guess I was able to figure out the terrorist attack in Sawat in that time period. But all I can say is that you want to see the distance of the other districts from that area, then you want to look at the violence, the number of deaths in each district, and you want to control it. I don't know, there's a lot that you can do with it, and if you do it, it is going to become a very good paper, of course, but you can take these comments from me, right? And thank you.
And a very good day to everyone. First of all, I would like to extend my sincere thanks to the organizers and the Lahore School of Economics for arranging this remarkable conference and for giving me the opportunity to present my work here. So today the research that I'm going to share is basically I have extracted from my PhD dissertation, and I am looking forward for your valuable comments and constructive feedbacks which will help me to further refine and strengthen my study. So the title of my research is the impact of the waterborne contaminations on the children's undernutrition status in Pakistan. And this research is being supervised by the Professor Hemanda
laptop and then we can click it.
Okay.
Right, is it working?
No. Okay, thank you. So we know that globally around there is 2 billion people. Basically, they do not have the access of the safely managed drinking water, and among of them, 771 million people they even don't have the basic drinking water services. And according to the IMF, the Pakistan basically ranks as the third who faces the water and sanitation challenges. And literature says that the unsafe drinking water remains a prevalent global health challenges and it ranks at the 8th leading cause of illness worldwide. And also literature suggests that the improved source of drinking water also carry contamination, and when you have the contaminated drinking water, basically it contains different pathogens. So the Escherichia coli or the E. coli is the primary pathogen that is responsible for the diarrheal diseases. And if we see the global level stats, so we can see that on a daily basis, 700 children under the age 5 they die due to the diarrhea. And in case of Pakistan, 53,000 children they die due to the poor sanitation and water-related issues. So literature also suggests that the diarrheal diseases also contribute to the stunting growth rate, that is approximately 13.5%. If we see the global level stats of the stunting, so we have 144 million children under age 5, they are going through the stunting growth rates. In Pakistan, we have over 40% of the children, they are stunted, 28.9% children, they are underweight. So if the children have these types of issues, so in the long term, we are losing the economic productivity. According to the Human Capital Index, Pakistan ranks at 141 out of the 174 countries, and World Bank suggests that if a child born today, they are basically expected to achieve only 40% of their potential productivity by the age of 18. And so if you see the table number 1, so you can see the E. coli contaminations present in the drinking water in Pakistan, different provinces. So you can see Sindh, Balochistan and KP has a very high level of contamination present in the drinking water as compared to the Punjab. Although Punjab has also very high level of contamination, but as compared to the other provinces, these provinces has the alarming figures. And if you see the diarrheal diseases deaths in children among the South Asian countries, so you can see the Pakistan experiencing a very high level of diarrheal diseases deaths. If you see different age categories like under age 1 month, under age 4 years, under age 5 years, so Pakistan remains at high who faces the diarrheal disease deaths. And you can see the stunting growth rate. So over the time, we can see the Pakistan remains at high to face the stunting growth rate, and the stunting growth rates are stagnant, and there is no progress over the last 3 decades. And if you see the provincial level stunting growth rate, so it is a very alarming. So you can see the KB, Punjab and Sindh has over 40% stunting growth rate as compared to the Punjab. And if you see the underweight rate, so again the KP, Sindh and Punjab is experiencing the very high underweight rate in children under age 5. And if you see the wasting, so again the wasting, in case of wasting, Punjab, KP and Sindh has a very high figures. Next. So based on these research problems, my motivations are strongly aligned with the Sustainable Development Goal 6 to ensure the safe drinking water and sanitation for all, and Sustainable Development Goal 3 to ensure the healthy lives and promote the well-being for all. So my research question is simply to analyze the causal impact of the E. coli contamination present in drinking water on the children's undernutrition status, including the stunting, wasting, and underweight. So to answer my research question, I am following the health production function theory that is originally developed by the Grossman in 1972, and later on Freeman added some environmental pollution variables in it. So my model is simply, my dependent variable is the children's undernutrition, including stunting, underweight, and wasting, and it is a binary variable. For example, if height to age, the standard deviation is less than 2, it is recorded as 1, otherwise 0. And if the height to weight to age, the standard deviation is less than 2, it is recorded as 1, otherwise 0 for the underweight. And if the weight to height is equals minus 2 standard, less than minus 2 standard deviation, so it is recorded as 1, otherwise 0. So I have some environmental variables in it, and so I have used the E. coli contamination present in the drinking water as the environmental exposure variables. Also, I have used the temperature variable. Also, why? Because literature says that the E. coli bacteria grows above the temperature 40 degrees centigrade. So I have used the interactions between the E. coli bacteria and the temperature. So I have some emerging activities also, like the improved sanitation, dust with the floor with dust, and media awareness, and the household education. Other exogenous variables, I have the children's statistics, household statistics, and the mother education. So I have used the multiple individual cluster survey data for round 6 of all the 4 provinces, KP, Punjab, Sindh, and Balochistan. And I have obtained the temperature data from the Google Earth engine, and for the estimation I have used the practice for matching and the average treatment effect on the gradient. So my preferences for matching equation is simply like the H is my dependent variable, stunting, wasting, and underweight are my 3 dependent variables. And for my treatment, I use those households who have the exposure of the E. coli bacteria present in the drinking water with children under age 5. So basically, in mixed data set, they collect the 100 ml water sample from the household, and then they use the compact dry plates for the analysis, and the levels are classified. So for example, if the colonies or the CFUs are found less than 1, it is treated as a control group, which means in those households there is absence of the E. coli bacteria in their drinking water. So I have treated that group as a control group, and if the E. coli bacteria in the drinking water present between 1 to 10, it is classified as a moderate risk, and if the 11 to 100, so it is classified as a high risk, and above 100 are very high risk. So I have merged the moderate, high, and very high categories as my treatment group, and the low risk is my control group. So other exogenous tables remain the same. So this table shows the result for the odd ratios. So due to the limited time, I will simply explain my key variables, that is the E. coli bacteria infections with the temperature. So you can see that yes, it is affecting the stunting growth rates and the underweight of children under age 5. It is significant and positive, and you can see if the household has the media awareness and we use the important practices, so it reduces the prevalence of the stunting and underweight and the wasting as well. And also, if the household follows the improved sanitation, so it also reduces the risk of the stunting, underweight, and wasting as well. Now moving towards the average treatment effects on the treated result. So the average treatment effects on the treated is basically shows that difference in the mean outcomes outcomes of the prevalence of the stunting, wasting and underweight among the children under age 5. So you can see the result for the stunting model. The variance matching shows the 0.032 standard deviation is higher for those children who have exposure of the E. coli contaminations present in their drinking water as compared to those children who do not have exposure of E. coli contamination. And same as kernel matching also shows the significant and the positive relation with the E. coli bacteria and stunting. And you can see the underweight is also also shows that the E. coli bacteria is impacting the underweight in case of the nearest neighbor, radius, and stratification matches. And in case of the wasting, you can see all the 4 methods indicate a highly significant and a positive relationship with the E. coli bacteria and wasting as well. So although my research is still in working condition, so I agree that there are so many limitations. First of all, I didn't use or add the provincial level fixed effect. I used the E. coli variable as the binary variables, although it is a continuous variable in the data set. Also, my observations, 75% observations are rural samples. So, and also, if you see the water sampling, so I have used single time period data rather the time series data. So, to conclude my presentation, there is some policy implication. Simply, there should be a awareness campaign, and we should ensure these infants and the children should have the access of the safe drinking water, and there should be implementation of the regular monitoring of the drinking water quality. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Aisha. I would now request Dr. Teresa as discussant to come and share her views on Aisha's presentation.
All right, I'd like to thank the conference organizers for giving me the opportunity to look at this paper and give comments on it. I think that Aisha has, by including all of the provinces, I think is a nice aspect of the study, because a lot of times people will just do take one mix from one time period for one province, and so she's incorporated all of the provinces, which is a nice aspect of it. Now, of course, drinking water contamination and its relationship to stunting is an important issue. The World Bank has been doing work with their WASH report about and looked at some of these really alarming statistics about the contamination in the water and the ways that it's related to child stunting. So the paper does a couple of different analyses of this data. So they're looking at different kinds of different child nutritional status, stunting, wasting, and underweight, and she does a logic analysis. And the main variables that she's interested in there is E. coli contamination in the water, and then the temperature, which she interacts with, and she controls for a number of some socioeconomic characteristics, education, media exposure, and some health behaviors, including hand washing, and I think the rest of it got cut off. If there was dirt on the floor of the dwelling. And then the other analysis is a propensity score matching. All right, so right now what she has current stunting status of children, and she's relating that with current E. coli contamination. But the thing is that you know, what's going to matter in terms of a child's nutritional status is the contamination of the water that that child has been exposed to their whole life, right? So there's a little bit of a reverse causality, not reverse causality, but a timing issue in terms of the collection of the variable and the variable that's being looked at. So, previous past contamination of water is more important to current nutritional status than current contamination of water. Now, another issue that's going to play any kind of study that relies on observational data is going to be omitted variable bias. So, here I'm talking about some of the relationships that could be happening with some of the variables. I haven't included all of the variables because then the diagram is getting too cluttered. But there's all of these kinds of relationships between education, wealth, diarrhea, contaminated water, and how those all relate to child stunting, either directly or indirectly. So, treating the diarrhea episode as an explanatory or an independent variable is a bit problematic because the way we believe that E. coli is stunting children's growth is because they're getting sick all the time, right? And then, so I just highlighted a couple of potential omitted variables that would also impact measurement of the impact of contaminated water. So let's say if a house is located in a flood-prone area, then that's going to be affecting the likelihood of having contaminated water and affecting their illness and affecting child stunting. So that would be a third factor, which would be affecting both the contamination of the water and the child stunting. And fertility or the family size, because when children are sick and then they're going to be spreading the illness. Let's say that they have diarrhea, they're going to be spreading it to other members of the family. And so there's a lot of relationships, interconnections between fertility and the diarrhea episodes, and that's going to also, both of those things, the fertility, the family size is going to be affecting both child stunting because there's less food to go around, but it's also going to be related to diarrhea episodes, which is going to lead to more stunting. So omitted variable bias is likely going to be, a problem in any kind of observational analysis of this type. My main comment, well, one of my main comments about the probability, the propensity score model is that it seems that it was a little bit tacked on to the end of the study, like it wasn't talked about very much. There was just like a little bit of a mention that they were going to do it after the discussion of the data, and then a quick table of results afterward. And a lot of the diagnostics were missing, so things like the covariate balance, the balance plot of the distribution, and showing that there was a common support between the control and treatment group, those were missing. So this kind of diagnostics are very important because propensity score matching isn't like usually the favorite technique for economists to be trying to do a causal analysis. And so again, any omitted variable, which I talked about on the previous slide with the diagram, is going to make it difficult to convince readers that that we have a causal effect being estimated with the propensity score matching. So what I would do in terms of moving forward is that I would definitely try to consider some alternative methodologies if you're going to be wanting to do a causal estimate for the impact of the water contamination on the child nutritional status. I don't think that anyone is confused that E. coli is bad for child nutritional status, but I guess if what you want to do is put a number on that, give a coefficient to what the impact of that is, and so therefore then you can figure out, how much, what would be the impact of policies and programs that reduce the contamination. Once you put a number on it, then it becomes easier to do those kind of cost-benefit calculations. But other techniques things that people tend to have more confidence in. Difference and differences in instrumental variable, regression discontinuity, and intent to treat effect. And, so in some of the cases, like community average of certain variables or district level values from the past can be used because they're going to be more exogenous. Now, if you do keep the propensity score matching analysis, you would definitely need to expand upon the diagnostics and stuff like that. And then also just sort of more of a expositional comment is, I guess, when it comes to the abstract and your discussion of your results, your control variables, you just want to treat them as controls. You don't want to try to give a causal interpretation to them. So just because you control for general education and it's negatively correlated with stunting, if this paper is about water contamination effects, you're not going to want to talk about your control variables in a causal way. You're going to want to leave that out. This is not my specialty area, but some directions that you might think about. I'm not vouching for any of these techniques necessarily, or any of these particular IB or RBD approaches, but these are ones that you might think about investigating further. So looking at things that are going to be affecting contamination or distance for houses from areas that tend to overflow and mix with sewage and stuff like that. So households proximity to some of those things, which would be a little bit more of an independent factor. And then also, if there's any information about upgrades to infrastructure and that occurred in some areas and not in others, that could potentially be a source of other variation. And also, I know you did do some temperature stuff, and I think that might also be a good direction to follow. So looking at deviations from long-term averages in the temperature, if that's going to be, if it's extra warm, then that might be more contamination. If it's extra low compared to average, contamination might be lower, and that might be an exogenous source of variation. So these are not ones that I'm necessarily vouching for, but these are just ideas to maybe investigate more fully. And I loved your introduction and literature review. I thought you did a beautiful job with that. And I like the geographic spread of the data that you're using, but I think in terms of the causal stuff, probably want to work a little